Thank you very much for coming to the Glen Martin and Andreas Bummel panel. So in the realm of global governance and diplomacy, certain individuals emerge as trailblazers. They dedicate their lives to fostering international cooperation, tackling global challenges, and envisioning a more and just peaceful world. Among these remarkable individuals, Glen Martin and Andreas Bummel stand as shining examples of visionaries whose unwavering commitment has made a profound impact on the global stage. So we'll start, of course, with Glen Martin. He is renowned for his expertise in his international relations and environmental sustainability. He's played a vital role in shaping the discourse around global governance. His extensive research and advocacy work have focused on addressing complex issues such as climate change, resource scarcity, and human rights. And he has consistently emphasized the urgent need for collaborative solutions at the global level. As a passionate advocate for multilateralism and global cooperation, Martin's intellectual contributions have inspired policymakers, academics, and activists alike, setting a new benchmark for global governance in the 21st century. Without further ado, you can go ahead, Glen Martin.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I have a paper, but at the end of my paper is a diagram, and I would like, when that time comes, I'd like to share a screen, if that's okay. My congratulations to the World Federalists of Canada for organizing this conference, in which I am pleased and honored to participate. It is so important that we all be talking with one another at this crisis point in human existence. Our planet is truly in crisis. In its systematic attempt to destabilize and undermine Russia, going back more than 30 years since the end of the Cold War, the United States is in the process of provoking World War III, a war that may well end human existence on our planet. I have articles on this that have been published in Mir magazine, which comes out in English in Europe. And I respectfully recommend that all of us reconsider this idea that Putin is an aggressive monster and that Ukraine is his responsibility. We need to look at it in a global context. We need to stop this madness of war. And we World Federalists understand that the only way of really preventing such madness is to establish an authority over all the nations that can enforce peace and disarmament. US President Joe Biden should not be the decider of whether or not we have nuclear war, nor should Vladimir Putin. Even without the militarized insanity of the US, we human beings face the possibility of self-extinction in the relatively near future. Integral thinker Irvin Laszlo, in his 2023 book, declares, quote, "We are at a tipping point in our evolution, a watershed that leads either to the extinction of the human species or the birth of a planetary civilization where humans live in harmony with each other and with life on Earth." Unquote. The existential threat of extinction comes from two giant directions, of which we're all very much aware: the very real possibility of nuclear war and the global warming, which some thinkers have predicted within 100 years will make our planet so hot that it will be unsuitable for human life. The writers of the Constitution for the Federation of Earth understood these threats to human existence way back in the 1960s when they organized a series of constituent assemblies to write the Earth Constitution. They published pamphlets and newsletters on the environmental crisis as well as the threat of nuclear holocaust. They understood that both of these threats to human existence are a consequence of the collection of militarized sovereign nation states recognizing no enforceable laws above themselves. It took them 3 decades of collaborative work before they finished the Constitution for the Earth at Troia, Portugal in 1991. These nation states, despite lip service, refuse to give up the burning of fossil fuels because they are all in economic competition with one another, just as they refuse to give up their militarized sovereignty. As global democracy thinker David Ray Griffin observed recently, quote, "At the very time when the two major threats to human civilization are, one, fighting wars, and two, burning fossil fuels, our leaders are devoted to planning for wars in order to obtain oil and gas," unquote. The global economic system is deeply integrated with the system of militarized sovereign nation states. If we want to survive as a species, the entire system must be transformed. That is my central thesis, and that is why I support the Constitution for the Federation of Earth. Exactly how must it be transformed? In my forthcoming book entitled Human Dignity and World Order, Foundational Principles for Global Democracy, I argue that we need a world system predicated first and foremost on human rights and the inviolable dignity of the human person. Neither capitalism nor the system of sovereign nation states are predicated on dignity. Yet the opening lines of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we all know so well says, "Recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world," unquote. I hold this affirmation to be correct. We need a world system premised on human dignity and human rights. A world system premised on dignity is also holistic. Dignity and rights are not individual properties that divide us from one another, but universal dimensions that unite humanity. Immanuel Kant rightly said, "Humanity is a dignity." We have an ontological need for wholeness, for a world of unity in diversity. A world system based on human dignity is also one based on wholeness, interdependence, coherence, and harmony. But let's look at the system that we have today. Capitalism is a matter of numbers only. Investment in productive enterprise requires calculation of costs of overhead, labor, materials, advertising, repayment of interest, and so on. There is no price assigned for human dignity, as a number of writers have pointed out. Kant affirmed that every human being is an end in themselves and can never be used merely as a means. Capitalism can only calculate the cost of labor, the cost of using people as a means, or as consumers, how much profit from each sale. Our dignity as ends in ourselves remains unknown to our global economic system. Okay, and secondly, the very existence of sovereign nation states also violates the dignity of humanity. Even though every one of the planet's nation state constitutions speak about dignity, the fact remains that in this system, each government is responsible for the dignity of its own systems, own citizens only. That is, for its internal affairs. In external affairs, if the government is militarized, then the dignity of others counts for zero, and this for two reasons. First, if the government has to go to war, the designated enemies that its soldiers kill are structurally denied recognition of their dignity. If their dignity were recognized, they could not be killed. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has a right to life, liberty, and security person. Everyone. Both of our world systems deny that everyone, the dignity of everyone. Second, each government in this fragmented world system is responsible for protecting the human rights of its own citizens only. Hence, human rights violations abroad are not its concern. When governments try to make it their concern, they have no power of enforcement. They can only engage in verbal protest or in economic sanctions that hurt entire populations. In addition to these two, there is a third way that sovereign nations violate human dignity, and this is in their internal affairs. Each government violates the dignity of its own citizens by making them party to its criminal military activities. They must serve in the military, or at least pay taxes to support the structural denial of human dignity. Nation-state struggles in general are not about human dignity, but about power and economic success. The system of sovereign nation-states is not a dignity system. And this is in spite of the fact that the majority of constitutions on our planet do mention dignity. They say, the German Constitution mentions dignity. Human beings have dignity. But structurally, in reality, it's forced to deny that dignity, because dignity is universal. It belongs to all of us. It cannot be parceled out on a sovereign nation basis. Today, there is widespread recognition that human beings need to be engaged in conscious evolution. Our planetary future is threatened unless we can rapidly move beyond environmental destruction and nuclear-armed war possibilities. Irvin Laszlo declares, quote, "We have a need to make our evolution on Earth a conscious, purposefully engaged and implemented enterprise," unquote. Barbara Marx Hubbard wrote an entire book called Conscious Evolution. She writes, quote, "Every tendency in us toward greater wholeness, unity, and interconnectedness is reinforced by nature's tendency toward holism. Integration is inherent in the process of evolution. Unity does not mean homogeneity, however, unity increases diversity." Nevertheless, the chorus of voices speaking of the need for conscious evolution is somewhat like the chorus of voices identifying ourselves as world federalists. Many of them offer no concrete way of making these objectives happen. They voice mere ideals without an effective process for genuine, rapid evolutionary change. And that is why the writing of the Constitution for the Federation of Earth may be one of the most important documents of the 20th century, on a par with the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Earth Constitution provides a template for a world system founded on human dignity, actualized through institutionalized conscious evolution. The entire system of government that it creates is directed to 6 foundational goals, the 3 main goals of which are ending war and disarming the nation, protecting universal human rights, and protecting our planetary environment. These 3 goals alone mean that the world system is founded on human dignity with its attendant holism. In addition, there are 2 bills of rights, Articles 12 and 13, that include all the rights necessary to ensure universal democracy, global peace, ending poverty worldwide, and restoring our planetary ecosystem. These are almost identical with the goals of world federalism that Karen Hamilton identified a few moments ago. All the officials in the organs of the democratic world government defined by the Constitution must take an oath of service to humanity. The World Parliament, as many of us know, has 3 houses: the House of Peoples, the House of Councillors, and the House of Nations. Even the representatives of nations must take an oath of service to humanity. This means that all the officials and all the purposes of the agencies defined by the Constitution consciously pursue the goals of ending war and disarming the nations, protecting universal human rights, and restoring our planetary ecosystem. This is what service to humanity means. The entire system is designed for conscious evolution. I will explain this further below in the form of a chart of the Earth Federation government that underlines many of the dimensions of conscious evolution embodied in the Earth Constitution. So just one more second here to summarize my thesis. Our human nisus toward wholeness and recognition of human dignity requires that we found a world system based on wholeness and human dignity. Today, worldwide, we are experiencing a breakdown of holism and respect for dignity in several forms of fascism, nationalism, corporate greed, religious dogmatism, and imperialism. This breakdown is a consequence, I submit, this breakdown is a consequence of 4 centuries of fragmentation, 4 centuries of capitalism and nation-state militarism. We all know that scholars say the present system of nation states was founded in 1648 in Westphalia, 4 centuries ago, when they were fighting with swords. Today we have nuclear weapons. National sovereignty has no place. We need the sovereignty of the people of Earth. They're the ones that are sovereign under the Earth Constitution. So unless we transform the entire system to one premised on unity and diversity and respect for human dignity, we have little chance of surviving as a species. The Earth Constitution is the concrete embodiment of both holism and dignity. It is our practical tool for conscious evolution directed toward a holistic world system premised on inviolable human dignity. Could I share screen now, please? I'll show a diagram of the Constitution.
I believe you should be able to using the share screen function at the bottom. I think it's enabled.
Okay, let me just minimize this for a minute. It says host as disabled participants share screen sharing. I think you have to enable it.
Try now.
Can you see the screen, everybody?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, wait a minute. Share screen. Okay, wait a minute. Here, I think we got it. Okay. You see it?
Not yet.
Should be.
We cannot.
It still says host is disabled participant screen sharing.
Try now, Glenn.
Okay. Okay, see anything?
We cannot see a thing.
Oh dear. Okay, well, let me describe it verbally then in that case.
You could also send it to me and I can share them on my end if that works.
I don't think we have time if we're going to be on our schedule. I'll send it to you anyway, and maybe I could show it later during the panel discussion or whatever.
Sounds good.
The World Parliament has 3 houses, and as I mentioned before, and it has 1,000 people from the grassroots of the earth, 1,000 electoral districts. We've already defined these districts, and we're now in the process of registering people as Earth citizens who will have voting rights within these districts. The House of Councilors, 200 people. The House of Nations, perhaps 300, depending on the size of the nations. That means 1,500 people. And what is their goal under the, they all have to take this pledge of service to humanity, as I mentioned. And what is their goal? Their goal is to create legislation which establishes peace, ends war, and disarms the nation, protects universal human rights, and protects the global environment. They're consciously doing this, right? They're not like the legislatures in Canada or the United States. They're not worried about foreign nations and how we're going to struggle, where we're going to get oil, what economics is about. They're not worried about those things. They have a conscious dedication to establishing the goals that are identified in the Earth Constitution. And the same with the four main agencies that are under the World Parliament, the World Courts. The World Courts protect these world laws, and the world laws are made under this conscious evolutionary goal of ending war and disarming the nations, right? The same with the World Executive, which has under it an entire world administration of 30 departments, the Department of World Education, the Department of World Transportation, and so on. What are all these efforts about? They're about the same thing, consciously evolving human beings so that we have a world of substantive economic equality, justice, freedom, and dignity, premised on human dignity. The enforcement system is civilian. And I think in Article 2, not only are the people of Earth sovereign, but the enforcement system is civilian. There's no military. This is absolutely essential because you can't have a military if you really respect human dignity. You just can't have people saying, oh, these are the enemy, you have to go kill these people, right? And the usual justification for that, oh, they violated, you know, they threw away their dignity because they invaded or threatened to invade or whatever, it's still violent. It's still not a valid argument because everybody has intrinsic dignity, intrinsic human rights. And here's the tour de force of the Earth Constitution, the World Ombudsman, the fourth main agency. The World Ombudsman, Article 11 of the Earth Constitution, its job is to make sure that the goals identified in Article 13, the rights that are not immediately enforceable when the Earth Constitution begins, they're not immediately enforceable because you won't have a world of economic equality. You won't have a world of protected environment. You won't yet have a world of housing and food and so on for everybody. All those are in Article 13. It's the job of the World Ombudsman to press the entire world government to actualize Article 13. So I think you can see the principle, and this same idea could be extended throughout. You know, there's 1,000 world electoral districts. Each district has an electoral commission, runs its own internal affairs in the sense that it has its own courts, it has its own office of the World Ombudsman, and so on. But the goal everywhere are these main objectives that are at the foundation of the Earth Constitution: ending war and disarming the nations, universal human rights, and protecting the global environment. So that's what I think is implicit in that quote from Irvin Laszlo that I mentioned before. You know, Laszlo says we're at a tipping point. Either we can move forward as human beings to a world of harmony and coherence, a universal university and diversity, or we can descend into chaos and human extinction. And I think that's the key. It's one of the keys. I promote this in this idea in my new book on human dignity and world order, that we need to be engaging in conscious evolution that has a mechanism, that has an effective governmental set of institutions that make conscious evolution something more than a subjective intent of people, but make it a concrete institutional reality. Anyway, that's what my chart shows or attempts to show. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martin. Sorry about the technical issue. I'll see if we can maybe give you the chance to show that before the panel, maybe. Okay. So we will be taking 3 minutes until Andreas Bummel's event. Is that a hand, Blake? Awesome.
That's
Okay.
me applauding the speaker.
I see. So they always look very similar to me. So I will be sharing my screen just to show the timer, showing the amount of time remaining until Andreas Bummel's presentation. And then you'll all have the opportunity to engage in the panel where you'll be able to ask Glen Martin questions about his presentation. So we'll be back in 2 minutes. Andreas, did you want to try sharing your screen before I introduce you? Yeah, perfect. Okay, so next up on the list, we have Andreas Bummel. Andreas Bummel is a leading advocate for democratic global governance. He's dedicated his career to promoting participatory decision-making on a global scale. As the co-founder and executive director of the Democracy Without Borders organization, Andreas Bummel has tirelessly championed the establishment of a world parliament, believing that global issues require global solutions. His innovative proposals, rooted in the principles of transparency, inclusivity, and accountability, have challenged conventional notions of sovereignty and pushed for a more democratic framework in international affairs. Bummel's unwavering dedication to the cause of democratic global governance has earned him recognition and respect among his peers and has become a driving force behind the movement for a more just and representative world order. Off to you, Andreas.
Alex, for these kind words, and also Karen for your kind words and introduction. It is a special pleasure and privilege for me to attend this World Federalist Conference of WFM Canada, which includes a UNPA model simulation. Because the World Federalist Movement Canada, and many I can see on screen now, have been involved very strongly in the efforts for the creation of a UN Parliamentary Assembly. And in fact, that's something I want to point out right at the beginning. The WFM Canada 3 decades ago has actually set the tone and put this whole effort in motion, on track, when in 1992 Dieter Heinrich published a landmark paper on the subject, and when 1993 the Canadian House of Commons Committee on Foreign Relations suggested that the 50th anniversary of the UN in 1995 should be used as an opportunity to create a UN Parliamentary Assembly, and the committee offered to host, or called on the government to host, this meeting. But it's also a more recent effort that Canada has been involved in. Canadian World Federalists have managed to mobilize many Canadian members of parliament to endorse the campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly. And the House of Commons Committee on Foreign Affairs again in 2007 endorsed the subject. Also, we have been able to be hosted by the UN mission of Canada more recently in 2017 and 2019 for discussions in New York on the subject. So I am really honored to speak here because obviously Canada is at the top of the list of the countries that potentially could spearhead the effort as we move forward in this difficult time. I was requested to speak about the design and the technicalities of a UN Parliamentary Assembly, which I will do in a moment. And due to the short time available, I was not planning to make much comments on current affairs. I agree with much that Glen Martin has said in his previous presentation. Thank you, Glen, for this, but I cannot let it go, to not make a remark on the subject of the illegal Russian attack on Ukraine, because on that point, I really strongly disagree, because what about the dignity of the Ukrainian people? What about the sovereignty of Ukraine in terms of, having a right, not being attacked and invaded by Russia? I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is no justification whatsoever. It's a blatant breach of anything that is important to international law and the UN Charter. And that's something, I want to set straight at the beginning right away. So moving forward, I would like to share this screen with you because I have prepared some slides which will help us understand the technicalities of the UN Parliamentary Assembly better, and which will guide us through my presentation today. So here we go. I am confident you can see this. First, I wanted to point out that the creation of a UN Parliamentary Assembly by now is firmly established in civil society quarters, in particular in connection with the new We the People's Campaign for Inclusive Global Governance that is supported by over 200 NGOs, very large ones, but also small ones from across the world. It has been mentioned that the UNPA campaign, moving to parliamentarians, has been endorsed over time by over 1,500 members of parliament from over 100 countries. The UN Parliamentary Assembly was recently included in the so-called Interim People's Pact that was worked out at the Global Futures Forum in New York in March, and that was published just a week ago. You can find information about this on Democracy Without Borders website. So I'm not going to talk about more regarding ongoing efforts and political implementation, but stick to my task that was given to me, namely the design and functionalities. First, I think it is important to recap and get an overview about the goals and purposes of the UN Parliamentary Assembly. First, it is about creating a connection between citizens and the planet. Obviously, the UN isn't doing this as a body that is composed of the executive branches of member states. Citizens are always intermediated through governments, and this should be ended by creating a direct connection through representatives. UN Parliamentary Assembly is supposed to support a sense of global citizenship through this connection. It can support democratization by giving a voice and a seat to democratic forces from member states, especially such in transition. It will help strengthen the legitimacy and the accountability of the UN. One, effects of which will be to lay the ground of making the UN stronger, because we believe these are two sides of the same coin. More legitimacy makes it possible to endow the UN with more powers. And so this goes hand in hand. A UN Parliamentary Assembly can facilitate the formation of global political parties. There are already global political networks from across the party spectrum, and those could be strengthened. A parliamentary assembly can help as a voice of global public opinion, can help pressure governments to act and deliver better on all sorts of issues that are on the global agenda. From a World Federalist perspective, the Parliamentary Assembly has an important task in terms of creating the, good political conditions that allow for a successful review of the UN Charter. The World Federalists amongst us here, they will know in and out Article 109 of the Charter that provides for a Charter Review Conference. A UN Parliamentary Assembly further would be a platform to drive a global constitutional process. One of the examples we have here to look at the regional level is how the European Parliament has been helping drive the process of European integration and constitutionalization, which is not yet finished. And finally, the Parliamentary Assembly at the UN is looked at as a first step only in the direction of a world parliament, and eventually should be transformed into such. In terms of transforming it into a world parliament, this means, of course, the creation of a global constitution, in fact, that has different pillars. These are just 4 of them. This is not complete, but universal legislation is extremely important, binding legislation, worldwide arms control, that includes the elimination of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear arms in particular, but also conventional arms. I think the issue of nuclear disarmament is very strongly connected with conventional disarmament as well, because if you imagine, I cannot delve into that more, but if you imagine that in fact nuclear weapons are completely abolished, that would mean that conventional armament becomes more important again. Anyway, so another pillar is the settlement of disputes in court, interstate disputes, but also other disputes in terms of how to interpret a global constitution, or in terms of the powers of the World Parliament and so on, which is the legislative body. And finally, of course, means of enforcement are needed, a peace force at first, and police forces, but also legal enforcement. That's why I put courts as a term in there as well. So key features of a UN Parliamentary Assembly, which we can look at as a process that is evolving into a world parliament, is first of all complementarity. We are not suggesting a replacement of any of the existing institutions in the first step, but a UN Parliamentary Assembly would be a complementary body to the UN General Assembly as it exists. It is a step-by-step process that would start in a pragmatic, modest way, and step by step, the body, the Parliamentary Assembly itself and its members, we anticipate, would fight for more rights and evolving into a world parliament as a kind of an automatism. It would move from indirect to direct elections in this process, meaning that, first of all, we believe a pragmatic solution is that members would, representatives in the UNPA would come from national parliaments primarily. In the process also towards the world parliament, the allocation of seats, guided by the ideal vision of one person, one vote, right, would nonetheless move from digressive to direct proportionality, like we have seen it in the European Parliament as well, which means that small member states would receive more seats per capita than larger ones. I will talk about that more in a few minutes. Also, at the beginning, for pragmatic reasons, tactical reasons also, because after all, this would have to be established by the UN General Assembly. At the beginning, the UN Parliamentary Assembly would have primarily consultative functions, but it would evolve into a body that has actual co-legislative powers globally. Initially, no charter changes are needed to establish a parliamentary assembly. That is an important point from an international law perspective. Because ironically, it is easier from that point of view to establish a UN Parliamentary Assembly with, I don't know, 700 members. It's easier than to change the Security Council and just add one seat, because that does require charter amendment. The Parliamentary Assembly does not. One of the key features is that the Parliamentary Assembly is supposed to include members of the opposition and of minorities who are now excluded by definition from any UN body, of the major bodies at least. A key feature is also that it would transgress national borders, geopolitical groupings, and a key feature then would be to embody this, that representatives in the Parliamentary Assembly would have to establish transnational groupings that have distinctive procedural functions and rights. Then the operation of the UN Parliamentary Assembly would primarily, political debates and deliberation would primarily be run through committees, subcommittees, working groups, the Parliamentary Assembly committees. They could organize hearings and conferences and so on. And they would interact with each other and finally put their insights and drafts in front of the plenary. Possible rights and functions of the Parliamentary Assembly at the UN, even below the threshold of UN Charter change, include adoption of political resolutions on any matter they find relevant, a right to question UN officials, reading and co-decision of General Assembly resolutions, participation in UN intergovernmental negotiations like COP and others, the establishment of inquiry committees that could look at particular matters. I don't know, there are many examples that come to mind, including, how to deal with illicit financial flows, sexual exploitation through peacekeepers, even subjects such as the origins of COVID-19 and other things the UN Parliamentary Assembly could deem, relevant enough to establish its own inquiry committees. Then co-decision at the election of top UN officials, including the UN Secretary General, co-decision of the UN budget, and the right to submit questions to the International Court of Justice. All of these rights that and functions that have been listed here would be intermediated primarily through the UN General Assembly. The UN General Assembly, for instance, could decide for its own procedures that it is not willing, for instance, to elect the UN Secretary General candidate for UN Secretary General unless its subsidiary body, the Parliamentary Assembly, has approved of the candidate in question. So we are talking about possible stages then towards a global constitution, in fact, and a world parliament. Democracy Without Borders has spent 2 years and longer to examine how a theory of change, how we can move, to 2045 as the 100th anniversary of the UN. it's an arbitrary date. It could be a different one. And as we move forward, we will have to adapt this theory of change always. There are unanticipated events in history, as we know, that we would have to react to. But in our view at this point, considering also difficult political conditions that are ongoing, we think that it is a reasonable and realistic goal to say by 2030, we can achieve the UN Parliamentary Assembly to have been established by the UN General Assembly according to Article 22. That is the mechanism I mentioned that allows it to do that even without charter amendment. Then we anticipate that the Parliamentary Assembly as a primary concern would analyze the dysfunctionalities of global governance. Glen has pointed out many of them, and I agree with this in terms of the need to overcome national sovereignty, for instance. So we expect and anticipate and would push for a UN Parliamentary Assembly to establish a constitutional committee. Such a committee, for instance, has also existed at the European Parliament. That has had a very important role to play over decades. So we believe that a parliamentary assembly, through establishing such a committee, would provide a platform, a global public platform, to deliberate on how this can be done, how a constitution could look like, including looking at examples that exist, the Earth Constitution, for instance, and help build a platform that is very broad, public, and includes also, that is important, governments that are like-minded and open-minded. According to our theory of change, then, we believe that in order for such a constitution, including the global parliament, which would be one of the bodies, included there, and in order for this to be legitimate, we anticipate that a global referendum might have to be held on this global constitution, and at the same time, free and fair direct elections for this world parliament across the world in all countries. There are many preconditions for this to materialize. We're aware of it, but I wanted to present this, potential path ahead of us. So from a cosmopolitan perspective, there is a problem in terms of citizen representation at the UN General Assembly today. Mathematically, the 128 least populous countries, who only represent 8.4% of world citizens, have a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly. So I would argue that it is highly doubtful that there is any democratic legitimacy in UN General Assembly resolutions and decisions from a cosmopolitan point of view that takes, the equal share and weight of individual citizens as a starting point, right? So the one state, one vote principle from a cosmopolitan perspective is very difficult, as you can see here. This translates also into how the most populous countries are being represented now at the UN General Assembly. They have a population of around 60% in the world, but only around 5% of the votes in the General Assembly. Who can tell me that this is democratic from the view of individual citizens having equal weight? Of course, I guess it is obvious that this is not the case. Nonetheless, we are not saying this has to be replaced. From a federalist perspective, it is okay and indeed needed that states are represented like this, one state, one vote. However, this is not enough. So the Parliamentary Assembly is complementary and would actually create a bicameral system, the General Assembly representing the states and the Parliamentary Assembly, on the other hand, representing the citizens. Nonetheless, this is not easy because I don't think that direct proportionality would immediately be possible. As I mentioned before, we suggest that at the beginning, digressive proportionality should be used as a starting point for the allocation of seats in a parliamentary assembly. This has also real-world examples. We are looking at, like, the European Parliament has a system of digressive proportionality as well, and that's despite the fact that's been directly elected since 1979, and arguably, compared to the entire world, there is more coherence politically across Europe So we believe that at the beginning, at least, we have to have a system of digressive proportionality. And I'm now moving on to explain, two models that we have looked at. I think, I have to say first as a caveat, there are numerous models we could come up with, right? I'm not saying that these are necessarily the best or those that would have to be adopted. It's just to illustrate the fact that it is possible to come up with good solutions, because some member states, as an excuse, they would tell you, well, there are no solutions for this difficult problem, right? And this is not true, as we can easily show. And I think the Earth Constitution itself has also some approaches that are worth looking at with their own, electoral districts. In this case, nonetheless, the existing UN member states are a starting point, as if you wish, electoral districts for pragmatic reasons and political reasons too. And we have here now two models I would like to illustrate. One is, first of all, I have to say, I think there are two principles that always need to be taken into consideration, or rather three. One is any assembly like this has an upper ceiling of members beyond which it becomes ineffective. So we have to set a ceiling, a threshold of, I would argue, at most 800, 900 or 1,000 members, no more. And then another principle that has to be implemented is any solution needs to be easy. It needs to be understood. It cannot be too complicated. It needs to be transparent. People need to be able to understand it quickly. And the third principle that we at least believe is necessary at the beginning is that each country, however small or large, has two representatives, one who is representing the government majority in the parliament, and the other who is representing the official opposition, however large it may be. So the first step in Model A would be to first assign one seat of those two seats to each country, which makes then 386 seats. Then we have 414 seats left that can be allocated, and those could be simply allocated one-to-one, directly proportional to population share, in world population share. But this immediately does end up in a system of digressive proportionality, and we have in the end 795 seats in total. In Model B that I would like to present today, it's a bit different, because in the first step we take the square root of the population size in million per country, which then ends up with 781 seats in total. However, in the second step, we have to look at how those seats, how that calculation has ended up, because there will be, if I remember correctly, there are like 60, 70 countries that have only 1 or 0 seats according to this formula. And then those have to receive 1 or 2 seats in order to assure the minimum representation. And in this case, we end up having an assembly of around 853 seats. And then we suggest that the UN Parliamentary Assembly at its discretion can provide extra non-voting seats for representatives of special stakeholders like youth, indigenous people, local authorities, and others who are not actually elected then from the national parliaments, but are co-opted, so to speak, by the Parliamentary Assembly itself. So I'm almost coming to the end, but there are a few things still that we need to look at. So this is one of the results in terms of the 128 least populous countries. You can see that in the UN General Assembly, they have a 2/3 majority, but according to models A and B, it's around 36%, right? So their share in the Parliamentary Assembly in terms of number of delegates is around half. And then you can look at the 10 most populous countries according to these models. We have some difference here because in the UN General Assembly, they have around 5% votes, but in Model A, they have around 33, and in Model B, around 22. So the larger states, they gain a lot of seats. And we can also see that Model B is a little bit more flattened. because it gives less seats to the largest states, and the mid-sized countries relatively have more. But the key point, which I think is important to keep in mind looking at all of this, and which is also, I believe, relevant in the UNPA model today, is the fact that in the UN Parliamentary Assembly, we do not have countries at all. That is a key point, right? We don't have a group of Chinese, Indian, or other delegates, at least not in principle and in theory as we conceive it, but the representatives from different countries, they are supposed to establish those transnational political groups I mentioned before. And this here is an example that you can see on screen of the existing groups in the European Parliament. There is not a German group or a French group or whatever, but you have the left, you have the Progressive Alliance, you have the Greens, you have Renew, the Liberal group, you have the European People's Party, the Conservatives, Identity and Democracy, far right, and so on. So they are coming together across borders, across geopolitical and country origin, to discuss issues from their ideological perspective. And this is key for UN Parliamentary Assembly in order to break up those rigid geopolitical groupings and nationalist thinking, regionalist thinking that dominates the UN. One example, and then I'm finished, in terms of allocation of seats in the UN Parliamentary Assembly for Canada. So I have in this table, I have simply put together the number of rather the percentage of seats each political group in the House of Commons has, and how this translates into seats in the Parliamentary Assembly according to the DONT method. That is a mathematical method that assigns proportional seats according to voting outcome that is also used often in European Parliament elections in member states. And this means that in Model A, Canada would have 4 seats, 2 going to the Liberals and 2 to the Conservatives. And in Model B, we have 6 seats. And according to DONT, I was surprised, but and I checked it multiple times, but that is what it is. The Liberals would have 4 seats and the Conservatives 2 seats. And we can come up with such sheets for each country. India is very interesting, you know, where you have very diverse political parties and lots of seats being assigned, right? So if India has, I need to look it up, has 100 seats, there is lots of space for these seats to be allocated to different parties that exist in India. I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm so happy I did not use more than 30 minutes. If you are interested more in the technicalities of all of this, each of the points I mentioned in itself might require an extra lecture, if you like. But if you are interested, you can have a look at the study we published on the UN Parliamentary Assembly, which has 150 pages, but certainly there's still a lot we need to learn, and this is still an evolving concept. And I would like to thank you all for your involvement, contribution, and your patience today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas. It's not as loud as in person with the rowdy applause, but at least we have a few people applauding virtually. So yeah, Andreas, I know you probably want to take a 2-minute breather, so we'll give you a couple of minutes. Dr. Martin, did you want to try to share your slides really quickly?
I want to move to the other room where I have more technical flexibility. So I'll take my 2 minutes to do that, and then I'll see if I can share the slides from there.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so I'll put 3 minutes, let's say, on the screen, and we will start the panel. Erica Wilson, our Communications and Media Director, will be the moderator for the panel. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Erica will be asking them for you. If you want, or if you prefer to vocalize your questions, then feel free to let Erica know, and she will call on you, and you can unmute yourself to ask the question. So I'll see you all in 3 minutes.
All right. Just finding Glen here, get him pinned. There you are. All right. Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you.
All right, wonderful. So thank you very much for your brief presentation. I've had the privilege of hearing you both speak at recent events by the Toronto branch, but I'm excited to have roughly a little less than an hour to get into some questions. We've already had some interested ones posted to the chat. Let's begin with this one. It is a question for both of you. The World Economic Forum proponents and attendees call for a great reset, calling for a shift to stakeholder capitalism, which they say will be best administered by the global elite. With the rise of nationalism across the globe threatening democratic institutions, how can your recommendations for improved global governance models effectively interface with the powerful economic interest to encourage support and adoption? We can start with Glen, if that works.
I would hope that there are powerful economic interests that understand the threat to human survival and that are willing to help finance the transformation to a world order that is premised on human dignity and equality. And we're looking for them. You know, we're actively engaged. We have one of our persons working with us who is out trying to do just that, discover such people. But the system, it has to be done within an understanding that the vast accumulations of wealth themselves distort our human reality. You should you're probably all aware that in the United States it's a mess. They're just, whatever democracy the US may have had, there are vast billionaires who are funding right-wing organizations, neo-fascist organizations, funding takeover of the US Supreme Court and so on. So it seems to me that that our vision has to be one that appeals to something in human beings, a kind of growth in human beings. We're looking for world-centric people who have moved from the egocentric through the ethnocentric to the world-centric level of consciousness, who really want to see this happen. And of course, grassroots funding as well is important in the under the project that we have. We're in the process of completing, which is the development of 1,000 world electoral districts. Each district has a commission. We're developing commissions within the districts, and the commission of people will be concerned with the funding of their district and in the elaboration of funding within their district. So they can appeal to local business people, local sentiment, local people who want to see their district flourishing. And so I think that's a fundamental option for human beings to look at economics as something that has grassroots and that can be empowered through the grassroots development of people with a vision of an Earth Constitution, with a vision of a global solidarity and a survival and flourishing of human beings into the future. So I'll stop there. I mean, it's a huge question, huge issue. So let me stop there.
Thank you for that, Glen. That was a wonderful reflection on very true, a wide-ranging issue. Andreas, do you have any thoughts?
I found that was a good response we just heard. I just want to add that it is indeed one of the biggest problems because I tend to think that we are in the best possible system for the elite, because it allows them to play 193 distinct so-called alleged sovereign entities against each other. The race to the bottom in terms of regulation is familiar to us all. And I don't see how there are big steps taken, how big steps are taken against this, even if there is now this minimum corporate tax, that's been decided and so on. I don't think that's effective. And it's interesting because I believe that in the 19th century and later, the formation of many nation states was actually driven by the elites. And in this case, I mean, it's not a coherent group for sure, but the elites are not driving the formation of a world state. Quite the contrary. I think what the question implies is that they are actually undermining these efforts. But I think it is key to see that it is not necessarily a coherent group, and there might be subparts of this group that actually see that, in the sense of Glen's response just now, that steps forward in terms of building a global polity are required, and the better choice than risking the breakdown of civilization, which in the end is not economically viable. One last thought came to my mind. 2 weeks ago, this year's global democracy perception index was published, a survey of 53 countries, and it was interesting to note that economic inequality overall is seen as the biggest threat to democracy, on top, far away from everything else.
Thank you, Andreas. Yeah, preventing the race to the bottom. Hopefully we can get people on board with that, whether wealthy or otherwise. The next question also comes from the chat, from Rebecca Shute from CGS. Welcome, Rebecca. Her question is, how can geopolitical groupings be conceived so as to not reproduce traditional polarities, thus de facto reinforcing national alliances, even if de jure constituted on a non-state basis? That may be perhaps more directed towards you, Andreas, with the Parliamentary Assembly.
Yes, thanks. Can you say again? I'm not sure I completely understood the question.
Sure. How can geopolitical groupings be conceived so as not to reproduce traditional polarities? Some examples: BRICs, non-aligned, etc.
Yes, I get it now. Thank you. Well, the point is that if we look at states, oftentimes, perhaps in most cases, except for closed autocracies and dictatorships, there is a spectrum of political opinion that exists in parliaments. You do actually have an opposition, even if it operates under difficult political conditions. It's there. So, for instance, it is not conceivable why this is a current issue, why the Democratic Alliance in South Africa would align with the ANC opinion in the Parliamentary Assembly on the issue of BRICS and so on, because they have a completely different view, right? So the representatives of South Africa would split into different groups because they have different viewpoints on that subject, So those groups, I believe, are really based on different perspectives coming from states, and that is empirically visible, that exists.
All right. Then we'll move to a question.
Can
Yeah,
I-
if you would like to weigh in, Glenn, I was going to move it to a question directed to you, but please, if you have any thoughts, I welcome them.
I think Andreas's perception is on the mark, that we need to find ways to evolve beyond the identification with with nations and groups and cultural attitudes and so on. And I mentioned before the process of growth, which is widely agreed upon among many psychologists and philosophers. It goes from an egocentric level to an ethnocentric level, to a world-centric level. That's probably where most of us are on this interview here, and then to a cosmocentric level. And in the structure of the Earth Constitution, the 1,000 world electoral districts, which from which the House of Peoples is elected, they're going to be running on political issues, right? Each district you elect. We have a mechanism called the Global People's Assembly, which gets people politically involved with electing their representative to the World Parliament, and so the issues discussed within each world electoral districts are not going to be, how can I be loyal to my country that is much larger than my district? It's going to be global issues, especially the ones that are crucial for the future of humanity. Sustainability. How can we have an economy which doesn't generate inequality? How can we create a world of disarmament, solidarity, and peace? Right, so I think that mechanisms, and I think the Earth Constitution has these mechanisms, need to be there that structurally bring people away from their traditional identities, their egocentric and ethnocentric identities. You know, that's a key thing. So I think Andreas and I agree on that, and I see that there in the Earth Constitution.
I definitely see that as a potential synergy between the two concepts. So thank you for that. I'm going to keep moving chronologically through the chat. So the next question comes from Alan Ware. And it is directed to Andres, but again, Glenn, if you have any reflections, please don't hesitate to offer them. How could one ensure democratic voting for a UNPA in autocracies and dictatorships?
Well, the response here is easy. You cannot. So I think the key to understanding this problem is looking at the creation of the UN Parliamentary Assembly as an evolving process. So at the beginning, we would have to accept the unfortunate fact that it is very difficult to assess in detail, and for that purpose, what country is democratic, which is in and which is out. And also the purpose of this assembly is to have a universal body. So we have to weigh between the principle of democracy, which is not easy to establish in this political context, and the principle of universality, which is important for legitimate discussions on issues like climate change and others. So, however, having said that, we need to also be aware that at this initial stage, where lots of parliamentarians would de facto be selected by their government and answerable to them, we are talking about an assembly that has primarily consultative powers. So at the UNPA campaign, for instance, early on, right at the beginning in 2007, there was large agreement, I would say consensus, that giving a UN Parliamentary Assembly legislative powers means that the members, the representatives, have to be directly elected in free and fair elections. So this brings us to the issue that we can only reach that stage once democratization has successfully moved forward across the world. And that is an entirely, a space that needs to be talked about. How can that be done?
Thanks for that, Andreas. Glenn, any reflections?
We've been, of course, concerned with this very issue also. We need global democracy, and many nations are not democracies. I don't think the United States is a democracy. And under the Article 17 of the Earth Constitution, the first operative stage can be achieved in a variety of ways. But one way is that 25 nations can ratify it, and then they have to turn it over within 6 months to their people for a referendum. So you need 25 nations. But you may know that the Constitution calls for a provisional world government and a provisional world parliament, and the provisional world parliament has held 15 sessions to date, and that's one of the issues that the parliament has considered. What if some of these 25 nations are not democratic? What if some what we have generated is a set of procedures so that any nation wishing to become part of the Earth Federation works with Earth Federation officials, and it would be the same if the UN is integrated into the Earth Constitution, which is what the Constitution calls for, that there would be coordinate committees, groups working together to articulate what the kinds of things that must be changed within nation states if they're to become members of the Federation. And it isn't just a boilerplate, because there's different cultures. What democracy means in China, in China's electoral districts may be a certain different synergy than what it means in South America or whatever. So we've tried to develop procedures for communication that allow an integration without diminishing the diversity of the world, right? Democracy needs diversity.
Thank you for that. It's not an easy question. Again, it's one of the core challenges of trying to govern democratically for the globe, is struggling with places that don't have it nationally. So wonderful to hear both of your takes. Alan Ware has a part 2 question here. The UN is strapped for money. The UN member states will only agree to a $6 billion budget, less than the annual budget for the New York police force. How could the establishment of a UNPA be funded? And I suppose for Glen, similar cash restraints, what kind of ways would it be supported?
Yes, I think, this is spot on again, this question. I think first it is important for us to establish a rough estimate of what kind of money we are talking about, because that makes a difference. And based on the examples of the Interparliamentary Union, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, or and other existing international parliamentary institutions, in the very initial step where delegates, representatives come from national parliaments, we are not talking about a lot of money. It's just a rough estimate, right? Which takes for granted that salaries and so on would come still from national parliaments, because it's a double function at that time, right? The MPs remain MPs of their national parliament and take on this job in addition, like they do, for instance, in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly or the Pan-African Parliament at this time. So the rough estimate is around 20 to 30 million per annum, which is not a lot, you realize. And at that stage, we actually do suggest that, well, the regular budget of the UN would have to be expanded by that amount. And I realize that might be a big obstacle, but it's something we need to deal with. It is part of the whole struggle of getting this established, to argue that democracy costs money. There needs to be an investment. It will not come for nothing. And those 20 to 30 million is really only funding a skeleton infrastructure. And if we move on to direct elections over time, I did mention, by the way, that we suggest that states, if they want to, should be able to have their representatives directly elected right away. So we would have a hybrid assembly for a while, some being directly elected and others not. But we are then, over time, we are moving to a budget from 200 to 1 billion per year, and that is a different story. But at that stage, perhaps we are also at a stage where it is possible to actually politically mobilize globally for funding directly coming, new funding sources directly raising revenue for the UN. Things that have been discussed for decades, and which means that those additional funds wouldn't actually come from state budgets, but that is far away. So at the beginning, it would be the regular UN budget. I think it should be possible to accept voluntary contributions, and like it has been included in the ICC statute, the Statute of the International Criminal Court, the possibility of accepting non-state money, non-state funds. This is very complicated, of course, because it is a political body that should not be literally, it shouldn't be possible to buy it. But like Ted Turner wasn't able in the 90s to actually transfer his 1 billion donation to the UN, why not? I mean, so this needs reflection. I think that if we have a skeleton body, it will be able to, that is part of the whole thinking of the logic. It will be there, progressive members of the body themselves will lobby national parliaments and others, so their budget will be increased over time. So actually what we need to achieve is really putting it in motion, and then there will be, in our anticipation, a whole dynamism of its own, where we don't, as NGOs, don't always need to push here and there, but a whole dynamism of its own that takes on its own life towards a budget, higher budget, etc.
Glenn?
Again, these are all very good questions, including this one, and I think Andreas is pointing out the vast difficulty that we're faced with when we try to deal with these questions of funding. The UN was founded primarily by the big three: Winston Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. And in spite of the rhetoric that we want to establish peace in the world, they defied the World Federalist movement of the time that we've talked about in this conference so far, which said we need a democratic world order. And they defied us by creating a body that allowed them to dominate, not only through the veto, but through the fact that the United Nations has no fundraising ability itself. The charter makes it dependent on contributions from nations. I was in the UN on May 1st of this year, just last month, and reviewed the Visitors Center, which is a vast center full of exhibits and so on. And it became very clear that the largest funder to the UN, who also hosts it in New York City, has colonized the UN, has colonized it, and uses the UN as a cover for its own imperialism very often and its own manipulations. And that's why people have said, for example, no one becomes Secretary General of the UN ultimately without US approval. It's the largest funder. It's always threatening to withdraw its funds and so on. But the question of funds and money is a huge question that many authors have written about. At the heart of the world economic system is capitalism. And capitalism is predicated not only on perpetual growth, and as my last book pointed out, there are dozens of thinkers say you cannot have endless growth on a finite planet, but capitalism is also predicated on debt. Money, 99% of the money in the world is created as debt. You probably are all aware of the struggles in the US, where the Republicans in the House in the US are holding the entire economy hostage because they're not willing to raise the debt level, which is now at $31 trillion, right? The US owes the people that create money in the US, which are private banking cartels called the Federal Reserve, they create that money for the US Treasury as debt, right? And this is true throughout the world. And this debt demands growth, because whoever receives the debt, they have to pay it back. They have to pay back interest and principal. And this, of course, has enslaved countries around the world that have received loans from the IMF and the World Bank. They're indebted. And so their countries have to be converted from the efforts to create sustainability and prosperity for their people to paying back this debt. You know, and the World Bank and IMF calls this structural adjustment. Right? We have to, if we're going to liberate ourselves as human beings, we have to rethink the whole question of finance and funding. And the Earth Constitution, Article 8.7, hits the nail right on the head, because under the emerging World Federation government, money is created debt-free. Any government has the power to do that. It's in the US Constitution. Congress has the power to create money, right? But the bankers deceived Congress, and in 1913 they created the Federal Reserve, and they said, oh no, you can only create money as debt from the bankers. Not true. And so the if we can reach the first operative stage of under the Constitution, which is not all that far away, I said before, 25 nations or 100 electoral districts can vote. This new government will create money. Money does not have to be created as debt, and therefore the whole question of funding, how are we going to fund the conscious evolution toward democracy, becomes transformed, because we won't have to, just as the UN is hogtied and hobbled because the charter does not allow it to raise its own money, right? And if you look at the struggles of the world, the non-aligned movement, which I've been looking at recently, which has as part of its principles the disarmament of nuclear disarmament and preventing spread of nuclear weapons and so on. Very good principles, but when you look at what the 120 countries are doing, is they're all struggling, because they're all in debt, they're all in chaos with one another. They're all really interested in how can I get something for me? How can, within this system of scarcity that we now call the global capitalism, the global economic system, that has to be transformed at the same time that we're creating a democratic world order.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm really glad you brought up some of the distrust of our existing global economic institutions and how these adjustments to our global governance framework can help to rectify the damage that has been done. Our next question comes from Norbert DaCosta, the president of the Toronto branch, and he has a question directed to each of you. They're separated out. So the first one is to Andreas. How will the responsibility for peace and security be divided between the UNPA and the UNSG?
So UNSG's Secretary General, right? Well, I think it is here again important to see, or first to identify what stage we are talking about. You know, if we look at the UNPA as a process, are we talking about the initial stage as a consultative body composed of national parliamentarians, or are we talking about the final stage, it being a world parliament directly elected that is embedded into a global constitution, right? So the response will differ depending on what point of time or scenario we are talking about. But anyway, I think that at the first stage, the relationship, or let's say the power of the Secretary General to use his good offices, for instance, wouldn't be impeded at all. The Parliamentary Assembly, I think, would primarily deal with UNGA subjects, or also bring subjects to the attention of the Security Council, adopt its resolution. So I don't see conflicts coming up here. because it would be a subsidiary body of the General Assembly. However, I think it would be at the discretion of the Assembly also to, let's say, direct tasks to the Secretary General as well as the General to the Secretary General as the General Assembly does.
Thanks. All right, Glenn. The second part of the question is directed to you. How will the proposed WCPA organize, coexist, or replace the UN?
The WCPA is the World Constitution and Parliament Association, and we are a global organization that is non-governmental. We support the Constitution for the Federation of the Earth. So WCPA will not supplant the UN at all. What we are working for is ratification of a constitution. And the Constitution, as I mentioned before, does not supplant the UN. It says explicitly in the Constitution that it will integrate all viable agencies of the UN into it. In fact, the UN has an elaborate, as we all know, an elaborate infrastructure worldwide that we don't want to abolish. It's valuable. The World Health Organization, UNESCO, all the rest of it. But think the General Assembly, right, which is made up of nations, could easily become the core of the House of Nations, right? So we, we could, and the Secretary, the High Commission on Human Rights, easily could become the World Ombudsman, which is dedicated to protecting human rights, and so on. So all these already organized agencies could be integrated into the Constitution. The difference is that the Constitution is not a confederation like the UN with no independent powers, but it gives these agencies now integrated into the UN part of an effective legislative, judicial, and executive power, which is what ultimately we need for the world. The question of disarmament, right? The Earth Constitution is non-military, and it creates civilian world police. But the creation of the civilian world police and the doesn't need to wait upon the approval or the ratification of the Constitution, because under Article 19 for provisional world government, it allows us to start any aspect of the Earth Constitution here and now as a provisional. We have the provisional world parliament, and under the system of world electoral districts, as they elaborate, they're starting out, as I mentioned before, with an electoral commission, which organizes the district for voting, secure online voting. But that they're not prevented from supplementing the regional police force and working with the police force that is there already in whatever country they're in, for developing a civilian world police under the authority of the Earth Constitution. So it's a grassroots movement to transform the present system, which is not dependent on the present system. But one other thing, one of our major initiatives, besides the World Electoral District Initiative, is to advocate Article 109.3 reform of the review conference of the UN Charter. This is the possibility in the UN under Article 109.3. Nations can call a review conference. In fact, this was promised initially when the UN Charter was formed. There was the delegate from India said, we will only approve this if you write into it that after 10 years, we get to review the entire charter. That never happened. The dominant powers with their veto never allowed it to happen, but it's called the San Francisco Promise. And So India is now, as a government, is now talking something about this. We're trying to pressure the government of India, which is very powerful and worldwide because it's so big, to advocate an Article 109 review conference. And if that's thrown open, we will advocate that the Earth Constitution replace the UN Charter without abolishing the UN, right? Just integrating into a real global government.
Thank you for
So
that
anyway,
response, Glenn. Yeah, thank you for clarifying the WCPA and its relationship with the UN.
Yeah.
We're going to take our first question from the audience, not from the chat. So Leela, you've had your hand raised and you sent me a message quite early on. Please allow me to pin you. And just a reminder to try to keep the question concise and consider time.
Sure. So first, I wanted to thank you both. It was great presentation. So my first question is for Mr. Bummel. I was wondering, you talked about a mandatory international jurisdiction, and I was wondering if you took into consideration the problem of sovereignty, would it be on a volunteer basis, or because if mandatory, we know how some states are reluctant to join international jurisdiction. So how would it be taken care of with that project?
Shall I respond directly?
Please.
Well, the goal of achieving universal jurisdiction, which is obligatory and mandatory, has been pursued for a long time by world federalists and others. And you are pointing to a very difficult issue, because obviously there is, not only in autocracies, but also democracies, there is a tendency to safeguard the alleged sovereignty that they have. So I think that eventually, to cut a long story short, having mandatory universal jurisdiction for dispute settlement requires a lot of trust between governments, but also trust across borders between people, a certain sense of solidarity and belonging at a planetary scale. And this, to me, brings us back once again to the issue of democracy. I think that a system like this, and that was referring to the vision of a world legal order that is based on world law, binding legislation, universal jurisdiction, so on. All of this can, in my opinion, only be achieved based on trust, mutual understanding and belonging, a sense of belonging and of global citizenship. If democracy is thriving at all levels, from the local to the global. So I think that eventually, I also believe in the theory of democratic peace, by the way, if it, comes to the point that all countries are democratic, or let's say most of them, that will open up doors for such innovations. So that's not innovations, but leaps forward. But even if all countries become democratic, that doesn't solve some of the problems we talked about, namely sovereignty, right, race to the bottom, them being played against each other, the global democratic deficit. So democracy actually then has to transgress national borders, and that then paves the way to this. So there's no immediate fix.
Thank you for your question, Leela, and thank you for your response, Andreas.
Good.
Oh, Glenn,
Thanks.
please.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and Andreas is correct. There is no easy fix to this. But one of the things that I think is important to argue for two nations and to people who are repeating this concept of sovereign. We are a sovereign nation. Every time I've been to Cuba and talked to them about Earth Federation, they respond, "We're a sovereign nation. We're a sovereign nation. The U.S. has no right to do this to us." They think of sovereignty as independence and autonomy, and that's correct. But the concept of national sovereignty is ambiguous because it implies recognizing no effective law above themselves, no world system above themselves. It implies lawlessness and chaos, and it also exacerbates the militarism, because if you're a sovereign nation, you got to protect yourself from enemies and so on. But sovereignty, if it means independence, and it should mean that, right? Each of us is a sovereign human being, because most of us on this meeting, because we have had the benefit and the privilege and the wonder of a network of interrelationships with others that have allowed us to get an education, that allowed us to be economically secure, and the rest of it. And this is what should be the case with nations too. What nations need to understand is that there's a difference between independence and autonomy and this political concept of sovereignty that recognizes no authority. If they were willing to recognize a democratic world order that had the common good of everybody in mind, then nations would be autonomous. But under the present system, the nations, as I said, I've been looking at the NAM movement and 120 nations, many of them poor and in the global south and so on. They say, we need our sovereignty, we need our independence, but they're under the hegemony of the World Bank and the IMF. They're under the hegemony of weapons that are being transported into Africa, all kinds of criminal behavior that they can't control because it's outside their borders. They're under the need to think in terms of security against other possible nations. That's not real independence. Right? Real independence requires a network that makes it possible, that supports it. And that's what world government will do. So there's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I'm glad that both of you could weigh in, and really wonderful question, Leila. The next question I have comes from the chat. I really like this one, so I'm skipping ahead because it's directed to both of you. It's, what are your opinions on a global taxation regime? How about replacing the existing national taxes with consolidated global tax? Thoughts?
Well, Andreas?
Would you like to go first? I have something to say for sure, but I've the perception that I have spoken first often when a question.
Yes, please. Let's let Glenn offer his reflections first this time.
I think that's excellent, and that it would be a real benefit to the UN if the charter were amended, right? Obviously, we have to get rid of this absurdity of the veto, and but it's very difficult. In fact, in 2016, the nations of the UN General Assembly voted on a proposition to abolish nuclear weapons. And it was 135 nations for, and only 35 nations against. And of course, those 35 nations against included Israel, the US, Russia, France, the UK, and China abstained. And they didn't even need to veto it. They just, we have these nuclear weapons. We're not about to give them up. As we probably, many of us know, both Russia and the US have been refining their nuclear weapons. I was in Hiroshima in 2016, and we talked to the mayor of Hiroshima. That was 3 weeks after President Obama had been there. And we're talking to the mayor about the Earth Constitution and so on. And he said, but President Obama gave this wonderful speech, and he said these weapons need to be abolished. He talked about the terrible suffering that happened in Hiroshima, and he said that, so the mayor wouldn't listen to us because he thought Obama was abolishing them, but Obama initiated and for years created the nuclear weapons review endeavor, in which the whole posture of U.S. nuclear weapons was reviewed to make them into usable battlefield weapons. And so now they have a weapon called number 12, B-16 number 12, which is targetable, precisely targetable, and can be directed toward any specific small target with for instance, Moscow, without wiping out everything else around it. And so they're not about to give these things up. And we need to tax the UN, we need to make it independent, and we need to change the charter to do this. I don't think that creating a parliamentary committee, in the long run, maybe it certainly contributes something, but it has no power. The General Assembly has no power, and a parliamentary assembly will have no power. And it may be able to communicate a global sea change in human thinking, but it's really imperative that we find ways to get rid of those nuclear weapons. And of course, the Earth Constitution, it seems to me that the most effective way is to initiate the Earth Constitution. Article 17, number 3, gives us a first stage that will then have a whole government, not all the world yet, just 25 nations, but a whole government that worldwide will be saying, these things are illegal. These things need to be abolished.
Right. Thank you for that, Glenn. Andreas, your thoughts? I can repeat the question if you need.
It was about a global taxation regime, right?
Yeah, correct.
And I think that is extremely important and needed. It is timely, and illicit financial flows and tax evasion play a key role in undermining democracy, undermining, the economic livelihoods of countries. They are supporting mafia regimes and political autocracy globally, kleptocracy. And if we were able to shut down tax havens, which includes the US, UK entities and others, then we would make a big step forward in terms of strengthening and defending democracy as well. But of course, taxation, like military, is one of the cores of national sovereignty, a subject we have spoken about a lot already. So countries are safeguarding their taxation rights and the whole field of taxation and finances very carefully. For instance, we now have this decision, or let's say policy, that a global corporate minimum tax of 15% should be introduced, but that's not a global tax, right? It is an agreement that nation states would collaborate and coordinate with each other, national tax regimes that would make sure that this goal is achieved. It's not a global tax. So that's an interesting example. There's a lot of disappointment around this and moves for a UN tax organization. So the whole process is more universalized and taken away from the OECD, who hasn't delivered in 25 years. That's the perception. But the problem is really, in my opinion, if we really talk about global taxation, right, that is not, that actually raises revenues for global subjects, and that is subject to global budgeting, for instance, through a global parliamentary assembly, we really need a revamp of existing institutions. The current UN has no legitimacy and capacity to manage hundreds of billions of revenue. That is just not the case. It shouldn't do that. And I recall ourselves of that motto, no taxation without representation, right? So the whole issue of global taxation brings the idea and the need of a global parliament to the forefront. Because I would accept some opaque, intransparent, and illegitimate UN to actually manage global taxes. That would be crazy. I mean, especially at this time where we have a process of autocratization, right, where the UN is closely, before being taken over by the autocracies. I don't want to be run by a UN General Assembly that is, composed as it is today in these governments. So it's a big problem. And again, there's no quick fix. One remark, perhaps, of course, yes, Glenn, you're right. A UN Parliamentary Assembly at the beginning would have no power. But that's the point, that we would get the foot into the door in the system and then have a dynamism in the system to support it evolving into something that actually has power and that actually builds a political ground for a UN 109 Charter review. There are lots of calls for UN Charter review. It's included in the Interim's People Pact of the Global Futures Forum, for instance. And I'm ambivalent about it, because in the current political environment, if we open up that door, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, the current environment isn't a good one, right? Geopolitically in many ways, and governments, I'm not sure there would even be agreement in theory over what we already have in terms of UN, right? They are still safeguarding their sovereignty. There's no sign, even in democracies, that they would wish to give away any of their sovereign rights that they perceive they have. So this is really difficult. We really have to first make sure that there is an actual, that the outcome would be that we want to see. We cannot initiate, in my opinion, an Article 109 movement if we are unsure what's going to happen. That's a big problem.
Thank you so much. I want to clarify that the session was supposed to end 12:25. However, Alex has greenlit me to go 10 minutes over. So as long as both guest speakers are okay, we can field a handful more questions. Okay, wonderful. Then we'll go back to our audience. Frederick Egger, if you'd like to unmute and share your question.
Yes, hi. Hi, hello. So I just thank you, first of all, thank you so much for your both of your interventions. I was shocked by a date from Andreas Bummel's presentation. It's the year 2045. And I was really asking myself, shouldn't we be starting by that, by this global referendum to have this popular legitimacy to establish this UNPA or world government, etc., the entire republic? So my question is to you both, is if you could share with us your vision, your strategy, your timeline of the best possible scenario to achieve the goal sooner than later, because 2045, we might be all gone already because of climate change, because of all the problems we're faced today. So please share with us what would be the idealistic scenario. Each of you have your own ideas. So of achieving the goal sooner than later, please. Thank you.
Thank you for your concise question, very poignant. We can begin with Glenn again, if that works.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Frederick, good to meet you online. We've been in contact. I've mentioned in my presentation the process of growth of human beings from an egocentric orientation to an ethnocentric to a world-centric to a cosmocentric, and many writers have talked about our present era being an era of the second axial period. Remember, Karl Jaspers said the first axial period happened in the first millennium before the Common Era, when human beings became self-aware. We became capable of our current self-aware operations and being able to conceive of the world as a whole and so on, and humanity as a whole. And if we're in the second axial period, I think one of the things we need to be doing is promoting that transformation of consciousness worldwide. And there are many groups, there are millions of groups devoted to that, as we probably all know. There's a group called the Evolutionary Leaders and so on, who have a committee at the UN, the United Nations. So there's influence in the United Nations to emphasize this. But in terms of referendum, what I mentioned before, our current project, besides trying to find a way to transform the UN and include the UN into the Earth Constitution, is the elaboration of the world electoral districts, the 1,000 districts. Each district has been delimited in terms of its borders, and so we're encouraging people within those districts to sign up. And what they're really doing in signing up is participating in a global referendum, right? And so the promotion and the getting out the idea to people worldwide, the millions of people who are thinking in terms of the second axial period and so on, if they could get the message that you can really give a referendum about a new world system simply by signing up as within your world electoral district. And we're in the process of creating secure online voting, which is very much technologically possible, so that people will, and this in itself, when people do this and they see, yes, I'm a voter, I'm a citizen of the world under the Earth Constitution. When people do this, it's transformative in itself of consciousness. You know, they'll begin thinking, I'm a world citizen voter, and they'll be wanting to vote on precisely how can we create global democracy, global economic equality, change the system itself, right? So my argument, just to conclude quickly, my argument is that the present world system, global capitalism, which Andreas and I have both talked about, as a huge problem, huge concentrations of wealth distorting everything, and the global system of militarized sovereign nation states. My argument is that the two of them, which are integrated in the world system, block the evolution of human consciousness. They block our ability to become truly world-centric and cosmocentric citizens. And so the effort to delegitimize national sovereignty and delegitimize egoism and vast concentrations of private wealth and so on, they're illegitimate. We need to delegitimize these and empower the global referendum that we're building through the 1,000 world electoral districts.
Thank you, Glenn. Andreas?
Right, so 2045 is a date that we chose as a linear scenario that does not take into consideration unexpected events. And I fully agree, we don't have as much time, but we wanted to come up with something that, as matters stand, appears to be realistic, even not desirable, right? It's not desirable, we need movement much quicker, that's absolutely obvious. However, you know, we have a trend of autocratization, civic space is being crushed in more and more countries, authoritarianism is on the rise, and you know, autocratic governments will not be impressed by any kind of whatever referendum or public opinion poll or people walking on the streets here and there where they can. They just don't care. If that happens, they will crush opposition and any of this, because they, more than anyone else, including democracies, they safeguard their sovereignty. And that is a problem, because we have come to the conclusion that whatever we do, the breakthrough moment of achieving global democracy of the kind we imagine it requires democratization at lower levels. We cannot build a global democracy while, you know, in Russia, in China, and other countries, people are being crushed down, where there is no civic space anymore, where human rights are just on paper, if at all. That doesn't work. And let's not start speaking about the problems of democracy in the supposed, democracies like the US, and where economic inequality is on the right, etc. So this is really a very complex problem. And only in democracies, the masses, public opinion can change government views effectively. It can happen in autocracies too, but only under very special circumstances, like we have seen in November, when the white paper protests happened in China, and immediately that were spontaneous, unexpected protests, uncoordinated, when the Communist Party immediately changed its course from absolute zero COVID to let's open up without any, precautions. That was crazy, but it showed that even there something can happen. So to respond very briefly and in a nutshell, in the ideal world where this transition comes quicker, the existing mass movements on the environment, on democracy, on economic inequality, on security, they would merge into a large global movement that supports the creation of a world parliament and new global structures, and champions overcoming national sovereignty and champions planetary consciousness. But such a movement, even such a movement, would have no effect whatever in countries where they are simply crushed down, right? So in this ideal world, democratization, people in China, Russia, and other countries, they would topple their dictatorships and actually bring about multi-party competitive democracy in those countries. That is my ideal scenario, which is unanticipated. At this stage, we are in dark times and cannot even imagine how this can happen, but maybe it will. But then we need to be ready to step in. We need to have the concepts ready. We need to have those connections ready. We must have spoken to opposition politicians and people who exist in the diaspora, from China, from people in Taiwan. And there still is, we have close connections to them. There is still a democratic diaspora of Russians, who are completely devastated about what is happening. So we need to now talk to the future leaders in these countries and bring to them the idea of planetary consciousness and global change, global democratization. I don't think, honestly, that the big, yes, I will finish in a second, that the big leadership on this will come from the United States or such countries, right? And maybe it shouldn't. It might come from a new democratic government in China. That would be such a game changer, imagine.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you to everyone who put your questions in the chat or offered them verbally. You contributed to one of the most engaging Q&A sessions I've ever had the privilege of moderating. Andreas, Glen Martin, thank you so much. You've made this an exceptional start to the first World Federalist Conference. I'm going to unpin you and bring Alex front and center so he can introduce the next session. There you are. Alex,
So
please
much
go
again, very
ahead.
informative panel. Thank you to both guests. Okay, so we'll be moving on to the Model UNPA briefing session right now. So for those that have signed up as delegates for the Model UNPA,